Perhaps let me start with you, Mamodupi Mohlala. It's an issue that's been raised. In fact, a couple of days ago, we were talking to you on a very important matter. We had to stop that interview because the line dropped. What's going on?
Look, the issue with the quality of service that we're getting with mobiles is most frustrating. And I believe that this is an issue that has been raised by consumers in my current capacity as National Consumer Commissioner. That is why you'll note that one of the very first things that we did as the Commission when we opened our doors was to undertake an analysis of the terms and conditions of contracts for the mobiles. But specifically, we looked into whether or not there are specific guarantees in relation to quality of service standards, which goes to the issue of drop calls or network failure and things of that nature. And we found that in terms of the contracts, the contracts that they enter into with consumers, there is no guarantees around quality of service. We then issued what we call a compliance notice to compel them to comply with Section 54, which guarantees quality of service. And to date, this is a matter that will that is before the tribunal, and the tribunal will make a decision around the matter. Should they find that there must be a guarantee around quality of service standards, what will then happen is that when there is a failure to meet a standard, for instance, in the case of a drop call, a consumer will then have recourse in terms of the Consumer Protection Act to be refunded pro rata in relation to the extent to which they had not received proper quality of service, or alternatively to get some other form of compensation from the network operator. And we believe this will then compel network operators to make sure that they get the required amount of bandwidth so that there is a reduction in the relation to the number of drop calls and that consumers get good quality of service. Because we believe that the real cause and the crux of the matter is that the bandwidth that's being provided is not at the level or in the quantities that the demand is out there.
That's a very interesting and important point, the issue of bandwidth, because I was going to ask that, William, about whether or not there are any infrastructural reasons why we have the kind of connections that we have in this country.
Yes, there's several reasons.
Yeah.
One is the shortage of bandwidth in the sense of spectrum, which is used to communicate between the base stations and the customers. And to address that, we are in the process of issuing an invitation to apply to release some more spectrum on both the 2600 megahertz band and the 800 megahertz band.
Wait, it's just on that point. Are you therefore suggesting that these network operators have taken more customers than the kind of bandwidth that they have?
Oh, yes.
Isn't that greedy, though?
No, they don't really have a choice.
I mean, shouldn't they say, well, this is the limit that we have. This is how far we can go given the spectrum that we have.
One could argue that, but on the other hand, they haven't had a choice until now about acquiring more spectrum. So the two pieces of spectrum we're talking about, the first one, the 2600 is for urban purposes, and the 800 megahertz is for rural purposes. But that's not the only problem.
Okay.
And that's in fact not the biggest problem. The biggest problem really is that we have the typical mobile operator has about 5,000 base stations, and up until now they've had a 2 megabit per second line which they rent from Telkom to connect those up. When you have a base station that's got 3 21 megabit per second HDSPA type transceivers on it, you're not going to get 3 times 21 megabits per second through a 2 megabit per second line. So what they have to do is they have to upgrade their backhaul connectivity, and they have been doing that since the liberalisation of the market as a result of the Alltech decision in late 2009. They're laying fibre. And they're also putting in microwave links, typically 75 or 100 megabit per second links, and they're doing that at quite a rate. However, they do need to spend a lot of money, and they do need to spend a lot of time doing that, and it obviously takes time. And then the other issue that one mustn't forget is that if you want to, for example, lay fibre, there are a lot of I don't think regulatory is necessarily the right word, perhaps it is, but there are a lot of barriers in the way. You've got to get wayleaves to dig up the street. You've got to get an environmental impact assessment to carry a fibre optic cable across a river in case the cable leaks. We have we have that in our legislation at the moment. The fact that it doesn't make any sense is beside the point. That's an additional issue that needs to be addressed.
In other words, in simple English, the network is overcrowded.
Yeah.
But whose fault is that? Is it the legislator's fault? I mean, you CASA are over.
We're the regulator.
The regulator, I beg your pardon. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
And Parliament is the legislator. Yeah. It's a combination. We've come from a situation where we had what was called managed liberalisation, but didn't really. That wasn't a meaningful term. And subsequent to the Electronic Communications Act being passed in 2006, there was the then minister was of the view that a few, if any, additional operators should be licensed, and that statement was taken to court by the Altec Group, and after the usual appeals processes and so on, the judge ruled in favour of the applicant, and that was that everybody who had any sort of a licence under the previous act has to be given at least as good a licence. And that led to us going from a situation where we had 11 previously advantaged licensees to 451 new licensees. But the problem is that because this was not a managed process, and it is not planned for, neither by the legislator or the regulator or the companies themselves, it was unexpected. We found ourselves with a whole lot of people who suddenly had licenses and then had to run around and find out how to use them. They had to go and find capital. They had to build a business plan. They have to do all the negotiating with various people that they need to do to dig up roads or find high sites or put aerials on top of buildings and so on. And all these things take a lot of time. And takes much more time than it would if it had been planned in advance. So all of those are contributing factors.
Sure.
They're not the only factors, but they're contributing
Let me
factors.
ask you this, William. There has been an accusation that the regulator is too close to the network providers and is not cracking the whip at the rate it should, and that you are not ordering them and making sure that they provide the kind of service that is required, simply because, at least under Paris Mashila was the previous chairman, and there was that accusation that the regulator is too close to the network providers.
When you're in an exposed position, you will always be subject to accusations.
Exposed position?
Look at Microsoft, look at ICASA, look at anyone who's in the public eye. You will always be subject to accusations, whether those accusations have any substance or not. One is subject to accusations. The reality is there are over 500 licensees. I think it's very hard to say that we're too close to all 500 licensees. We do crack the whip. We perhaps don't crack the whip as much as we would like to. And there are reasons for that, one of which is we don't have all the powers we'd like to. We don't necessarily have all the evidence we'd like to. So, for example, we have done some tests on exactly what you were referring to just now in terms of dropped call rates and things like that. And whilst those tests were not tests as specified in terms of the license conditions, in other words, the license conditions requires I'm talking about the mobile operators in particular here. The license conditions require the mobile operators to achieve certain quality of service levels averaged over a 6-month period, and we did some spot checks, some snapshot checks. None of the operators achieved the targets in those snapshot checks. Okay. However, because they were snapshot checks, we were not in a position to be able to beat them with a stick about it because they were only snapshot checks. They weren't the average figures over 6 months. On the other hand, we have subsequently received the compliance reports from many operators, and of those operators, by no means all of them were compliant. And where the issues were unable to be resolved, sure, we have referred some of those operators to the CCC for prosecution.
Let me ask the Commissioner, the National Consumer Commissioner here. Are they cracking the whip as best as they should on behalf of us, the consumers?
Look, from where we sit, we believe that a lot can be done in relation to the ICT sector, especially in relation to making sure that we protect consumers. And I have heard the Councillor speaking to issues of rights of access, the network upgrade, etc., etc. But when you look at the profits that are being made, we actually believe that these mobile operators have the financial muscle to obviously upgrade their networks, and because they are taking on consumers and consumers expect a certain quality of service, then they must upgrade and get rights of way of access, because it's in the legislation. It's about how you negotiate and who you speak to and how you speak to them. They need to make sure that they actually make sure that the services are available to consumers. So as you put it, I think you put it very correctly, that we have a situation where people are actually putting profits over the consumers that they're supposed to properly service. So as the Consumer Commission, we felt it was incumbent on us to actually go out and start to crack that whip in relation to the mobile industry.
Let's do some comparisons here. What the service that we're getting here in South Africa in particular, how does it compare to services internationally?
Well, it would obviously depend which countries you're looking at or trying to benchmark yourself against. One level is pricing versus quality of services. Other
developing countries.
So if you look at other developing countries, particularly our continent, we're probably one of the best performing markets. If you look, the problem in most African markets, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, is that those networks are far more overcrowded than what we have in South Africa at the moment, or have had. Just because there was dearth and of those facilities and a very high pent-up demand to access those communication facilities and ability to communicate. If we look at other markets, developing markets, whether we look at South America or Asia, again, on average, we probably find countries that are perform better in terms of delivery of quality versus cost. And countries that probably perform similar to South Africa or maybe even worse. It all depends on the market. So I would suppose we're not either end of the spectrum. When it comes to pricing, we tend to be on the high side. Those prices have been coming down, particularly if we look at, for instance, data, which is the latest main development in the market, mobile data, on the basis of 3G networks, various flavors. And we, against various peer groups, we're not the highest. There are some outliers, but we've got operators that tend to be on the higher side rather than within a comparative group.
That's interesting, because there's an SMS exactly around that issue. It says, but why is the cost of cell phone cheaper in Maputo, 30 rand for 500 minutes? So in other words, there are other African countries, such as Maputo, that are much cheaper than us.
No, I'm not saying that there are not less costly or countries where the usage of mobile telecommunications is less costly. There are many countries by now that in Africa where the cost to communicate, what you pay per minute or per second, whatever the billing is lower than in South Africa. I was speaking in terms of quality. So you pay less, you may not necessarily get the quality that's correspondent to that, but
we pay quite a lot, but actually we don't get the quality correspondent to that either.
What we have seen in many African markets, or certainly in a number of African markets over the past 2 years, is a price war that was evolved, and some of those markets that was based on the entry of new investors into the markets, where as a strategy they opted to go in on a price competitive platform, and that has resulted in a downward spiral of prices. Obviously, we don't like to communicate for as little as possible and obtain as best quality as possible. The flip side is that in some of those markets, what the regulators have started to look at, the national regulatory authorities or counterparts to ICASA in South Africa, is price floors, which has happened in the Congo, for instance, the DRC, where Kenya is looking at it, because they have come to the conclusion that the price has dropped to such a level that it's becoming unsustainable for operators to maintain quality and improve quality of networks and continue investing, because they're not, the revenues are now beginning to deteriorate on account of lower prices.